potentially there is actually something common in the experience of poor mental health, no matter its form, that is involving a disruption of that interpretation or sense of bodily state. As soon as you have a disruption in your embodiment, as soon as you experience chronic pain, a physical injury, etc., your mental health immediately becomes vulnerable. And so what the research shows, and it's essentially definitive.
Dr. Camilla Nord is a neuroscientist and head of the Mental Health Neuroscience Lab at Cambridge, whose work rewires how we think about illness. The mind is bodily. She's mapped a shared brain hub for interoception across depression, anxiety, and more, and pioneered ways to personalize treatments from brain stimulation to smart therapy augmentations. She's the author of The Balanced Brain, the best predictive brain account for mental illness that I've ever seen, and why there's no one-size-fits-all cure, and how small, targeted shifts in body and brain can change everything. Subscribe if you want your insula to make better predictions about your life, and because your gut instinct already knows you don't want to miss the conversations that we have coming up next.
They get told it's all in your head, it's a mental health problem, it's like depression. But what they really show is that you can have a physical health problem, a totally physical health problem that is generated by changes in your brain. Your brain can create physical symptoms, and we don't entirely understand why or how, but we know it's possible. Really opens your eyes as to, in fact, the human experience, the fact that when you have a physical symptom, physical experience, you personally do not know the cause. Even if you are a highly educated neuroscientist, etc., you have no way to know, is this something that's happened to my pinky or something that my brain is generating that I feel about my pinky? So in terms of treatment, the types of treatments that I think could be extraordinarily promising going forward are what I think of as
Dr. Camilla Nord, are all mental experiences represented in both the brain and body?
I would argue yes. Things that you think of as totally in your brain or totally in your mind in some ephemeral place are instantiated physically, but not just in your head, as we might have previously believed, actually physiologically all over.
I love this. Let's dive into this further. This has been really interesting for me in the last while. What do we know about how an experience that previously we might have thought as of just being mental, like anxiety or depression or trauma, how might that be represented in the body? Like, can I hold trauma in my pinky? Is that a thing?
Actually, I don't love that particular metaphor. I mean, it's useful metaphorically, not really true scientifically, that you kind of physically hold trauma in your body, but your body changes as a result of your experience of trauma and changes in anticipation of kind of future events, which may or may not relate to previous traumas. So I think that's like the scientific sense in which it's true. The sense in which it's different, honestly, if you were to ask someone experiencing a mental health disorder, experiencing being human, they would probably tell you just how physical their emotions really are. You know, really big disruptions in emotions, like in a mental health condition, or the little emotions you feel day to day happen in your body because you feel them in your body. And then the way this works out, actually, from a scientific perspective, is you have changes in your peripheral nervous system, you have changes in your gut, you have experiences where you might feel nauseous when you're nervous. You might even have to run to the loo. And those are all types of nervous system results of that emotional experience you're feeling.
So very interesting distinction there. So you're saying that it's less so the case that the physical substrate of the emotion is stored in the body. It's just experienced or felt there. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I think that the idea of something being stored is actually a very brain-based idea in many ways. And I'll give you like one of my favorite examples, which is about inflammation. So we found out a couple years ago as a kind of scientific community, this wasn't me personally, that if an animal experiences peripheral inflammation, in this case, it was a kind of, induced by the scientists running the study. You get this activation of certain brain cells in the brain called the insula, which I'm really interested in. So these brain cells like light up, they fire, and they store this memory of the inflammation such that even when the animal resolves the infection, gets better, is no longer inflamed, if you just activate those brain cells again, the infection symptoms can return and the animal seems to feel unwell again. So that means that some storage happened in the brain of that physical experience. And in fact, that the brain cells were enough to re-evoke that physical experience. And I love that. That is just so compelling.
Very interesting. I just spoke to a Nikolai Kukushkin in NYU. He published a pretty groundbreaking paper in the last year or two showing that cells in the body are capable of storing memories, what he is defining as a memory, in a way that we previously didn't think that they really could. And that whole discussion led into like the gut instinct and everything else, and like how real that analogy really is. And I really wonder, would he actually disagree a little bit with you in that I think he now thinks the physical storage of memories is actually a little more distributed in the body than we previously thought.
Okay, maybe I am a kind of brain-centric person after all. So yeah, I agree with you that there are sort of rudimentary things that you might think of as memories in the rest of the body and in cells in the body. I suppose, we started thinking about trauma. So I really did think of kind of the experience of an event, and that essentially is in the brain, but we experience it in the body because of the brain's connection to the body. But of course, cells outside of our brain have the capacity to change and be reactivated and have some, of course, our immune system has a memory to it. That's how it works. So there are lots of interesting examples of kind of peripheral memory. I'm just like such a boring neuroscientist that I think of memory as being, maybe fancier.
No, it definitely would have been my background and training is in neuroscience. And I think I started the podcast with an incredibly brain-centric view of the world. And then every episode it becomes not less so, but just the amazing incredibleness of biology to distribute the information processing, the predictive ability across the whole body. Conversations with Dr. Michael Levin, I am Dr. William Jr. I'm fully believing that cells are conscious, they're intelligent agents, and we are an amalgamation of trillions of different consciousnesses. And this just has so much implications for biology. Some neuroscientists, I think, maybe like yourself, are still a little bit skeptical on that. But I definitely have like this richer idea of biology being maybe not dethroning the brain, but just really kind of realizing the potential of the body as well.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly am a neuroscientist who very much believes in the potential of the body. I suppose the bit where my bias comes out is that I really do think it's coordinated by the nervous system, not involving other systems, but perhaps, I mean, otherwise, why would I study it? So it's a bias that comes out even in my career choice. But I think what the nervous system does, the central nervous system in the brain and the peripheral nervous system throughout the body, is so remarkable in the way that it orchestrates other physiological systems, whether that might be the movements of your gut or things that are happening even as far away as your liver. And so there's just this kind of incredible, not always synchrony, but coordination between the nervous system and these other systems.
Yes. Let's go to interoception. So how can the state of the body, our physiology, impact our behavior and impact our brain?
So interoception is defined as our sense of the physiological condition of the body. And some people think of this as a purely conscious sense. So let's say, be quiet for a second and think about when you feel your heartbeat. Not everyone can do that, but that's an example of interoception. Or think about whether you need oxygen. That's an example of interoception. Think about whether you're hungry. But actually, a lot of this happens, most of it happens unconsciously, because most of what we have to do in interoception is survive. We have to make sure that those oxygen levels don't get too low. We have to make sure that our energy levels don't get too low. And so all of these kind of instincts, thirst, another example of interoception, all of these instincts often don't even have to break through into our consciousness. They're just happening. But that doesn't mean they don't influence us. And that's one of the most interesting things. So if you've ever experienced something I write about in my book, but that absolutely fascinates me, if you've ever experienced feeling hangry, that is an example of where an interoceptive signal, hunger, is being misunderstood, misappropriated maybe as an emotional signal. But it's much more interesting than just low blood sugar making you grumpy. There was a great experiment that came out the other day showing that your mood tracks your blood sugar as you would expect. So when your blood sugar goes down, so too does your mood. But the whole thing is mediated, and statistically 100% mediated by your subjective hunger. Yes. So it's actually your interoception, your sense of that metabolic state, not the objective metabolic state that's affecting your emotion.
Really cool. I love it. It might be useful to kind of set up this framework of the predictive brain. That I think that links in really well with interoception, and will kind of lead in with the rest of the conversation as well. So maybe set up this idea of the predictive brain.
So for many, many years, neuroscientists thought of the brain as a receiver. So something like cells in your eyes, at the back of your eyes and your retina, are receiving information from the outside world, communicating these signals to lateral nucleus, communicating them to visual cortex, and up to the brain. And then you're like, oh, I see. But in fact, what we now understand is that although that's happening, that's in many ways a minority of your contributions to your vision, because there are enormous numbers of signals coming in the other direction. And what those signals are doing is predicting what you're about to see before you see it. And of course, this doesn't just apply to sight, but maybe it's most interesting because we think of sight as a passive thing. But actually, the reason we see visual illusions, the reason why there are kind of limitations on what our vision can and cannot see, is to a large degree dependent on these predictive expectations of what we're about to see. So it's true with exteroception, like vision, perception of the outside world. And it is even more true with interoception, in my opinion, because the signals are much noisier. The signals we're getting from bodily systems are very complex, and they all kind of converge on similar regions in the brain, meaning that what's really dominating our interoception is our predictions. And I also think another reason it's particularly dominant is this survival mechanism of interoception. The fact that what we need to know is not, am I literally in this moment dying of thirst? But in fact, if at some future moment that could be an imperative, then thirst becomes an imperative now. So actually the predictive quality goes hand in hand with the survival quality of interoception. And I think of this as being common to all bodily states. So recently, we just put out a new theory in the field about the predictive quality of metabolic states. So sometimes this gets a little bit neglected because you think of like blood sugar as just happening passively. But actually, your own expectations have an influence, not just on how your brain might process a metabolic change, but actually on how your whole body does. So if you're expecting more calories, your body metabolizes a little bit differently than if you're expecting fewer calories. This is true. So cool. And just absolutely remarkable.
That's so cool. I love it. Really, really well explained. Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it. I find this to be one of the most practical takeaways I've gotten from neuroscience in all my time learning about it. And one example of this is in my running. I'm an endurance athlete. I like doing triathlons and marathons, etc. And I first read this in Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, How Emotions Are Made, about this idea when we get an interoceptive signal, our first instinct or our first guess on what that signal means might not be that accurate. So I interpret this when I'm running, that when I'm really feeling bad, it's not necessarily that I'm doing damage to my body, that if I don't stop, I'm going to pass out, I'm going to vomit, even though I feel like I'm going to do both of those things. And oftentimes I can retrain that signal as it's being sent to me to think, okay, this is where progress is being made. This is a sign that the exertion is having a positive adaptive effect, and I'm exercising at my limits. And I often find that even just like consciously thinking that and really trying to hold that thought, correct my body posture, it can really retrain those signals. And oftentimes 2 or 3 kilometers go by and I don't notice, and then my body actually feels a lot better again. And I'm like, wow, that first signal that told me that I really need to sit down, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble, wasn't that accurate at all, because now I feel great. Somehow my heart rate has gone down 10 beats per minute. My back is straighter. My hips are up. It's a completely different physiological state that I'm in, except I didn't stop. I just kept running. So that it shouldn't be possible under this logical framework of like the signal is accurate.
Yeah. And that lesson you learned is essentially the route to recovery for people with panic disorder. So if you're someone who's experienced panic attacks, part of that is a misinterpretation of the bodily signal. The first time it happens, it essentially just feels like you're having some horrible disruptive physiological event, like a heart attack. And you've never had a heart attack potentially. And so that's what it feels like to you. But in recovery, you begin to learn, just as you did, Evan, you begin to learn that those signals are not necessarily danger signals in and of themselves. They can mean something else. They can just mean you need to find a way to, get out of a particular situation, or you need to find a way to regulate it, which is one of the most powerful things actually about interoception, is that we have this control over interoceptive signals to some degree. There are some things we can do that could actually change the signal as well as change our brain, which is what you were doing. So we sort of have that dual power, almost the interpretative power, but also the kind of literal power to slow your breathing, eat something, drink something, and so on.
Right. What do we know about the dysfunction of interoception in cases of mental illness like depression and anxiety? How is our interoceptive prediction, how does that dial go wrong in cases of mental illness?
So what my lab and other labs have found is that there's this common disruption in interoception across mental health conditions, which is very interesting. This is a transdiagnostic phenomenon. It's incorrect to think of it as a problem in depression, a problem in anxiety. And maybe some of that has to do with the kind of flaws of our diagnostic framework, the fact that, in fact, diagnoses are not really real. They're just our best way of kind of describing the nature of symptoms, but there's nothing totally definitive about their boundaries. But there's another thing probably that it means, because it's not like diagnoses mean nothing. They do describe some reality. And so I think this kind of common disruption in interoception, which we show, it, for example, in the brain, there's a common region of disruption that happens, dysregulated processing in the insula, irrespective of your diagnosis when you're doing some kind of interoceptive task. And so that means potentially there is actually something common in the experience of poor mental health, no matter its form, that is involving a disruption of that interpretation or sense of bodily state. But that doesn't mean it's the same everywhere. It just all affects this dimension. I actually think it affects different parts of interoception in different conditions and even in different directions. So for a long time, there was an idea that maybe there's a kind of blunted interoception. You don't have as accurate a sensation of bodily signals in some conditions, but that is probably only true of a subset of mental health conditions. And there may well be other people, for example, people who respond very poorly to mindfulness therapy. That is a group who really don't do well when asked to pay more attention to their body. Sometimes they experience even a dissociative episode. And that could be because there already is an excess of interoceptive signals, or perhaps interoceptive attention to those signals, which actually dampening down would be better.
Interesting. Very interesting. I think I resonate with this, and when I was reading The Balanced Brain, your book, which is fantastic, I was really relating to the aspects of how embodiment can be very correlated with positive mental health. At least for me, I noticed this more than anything, is that I think I've always had a positive disposition, genetics, environment, everything. I've never really suffered from depression or even major anxiety. And I've kind of always subconsciously associated that with a very strong embodiment. Like in moments when I'm feeling very positive, I'll feel very grateful for my body. I'll feel very connected to my arms. I'll feel very connected to my leg. It sounds strange for maybe for people that don't have this association, but I was really curious on what the research shows in terms of how correlated, like how embodied you are physically, and the positivity of your mental health and disposition and general outlook on life. Has there been good data there?
Well, I love that you've put it in such a positive way. And I absolutely agree with you, personally, in terms of embodiment having this really positive quality for me. But one of my real motivations to write The Balanced Brain in the first place was because I really wanted to give people the ability to see just how blurry the boundaries between physical and mental health really are. And so what the research shows, and it's essentially definitive, is the exact other side of the coin of what you've described, which is that as soon as you have a disruption in your embodiment, as soon as you experience chronic pain, a physical injury, etc., your mental health immediately becomes vulnerable. This is something that is true empirically. It's also something I've experienced personally. So as soon as you have a kind of physical insult, your brain has to work 10 times harder to maintain some kind of semblance of normality, because its system in the world, in its inside world, has been disrupted. And I think this is why you see such an enormous comorbidity between physical and mental health conditions. That's one direction of causality. You also, of course, see the other direction of causality. If you're somebody who has experienced periods of very vulnerable mental health, you're actually more likely to develop chronic pain in the future, for example, also diabetes. So there are various other connections that happen in that direction, where vulnerabilities to poor physical health can predispose you to episodes of poor mental health in the future.
Right. Do we know what might be different in cases where someone has poor physical health but their mental health doesn't degrade? So my example is I was sick for a number of years with a heart condition called POTS in my teenage years, and I wasn't really able to get out of bed. It was pretty tough, but I don't think I was ever depressed. And I don't mean this to be like, oh wow, I'm great. I do think it was just my genetics and disposition. But for some reason in that case, my physical health didn't really lead to any, I would say, degrading in my mental health, at least in my day-to-day mood.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, one thing to say is that it's not that it always affects depression specifically. So some people genetically and through other reasons have more of a predisposition for depression, and other people may have more predispositions for other problems, or indeed resilience to developing those particular problems. You see this sometimes with patients who experience sort of one very localizable physical health problem, where actually solving that problem becomes almost a benefit to their mental health, or protective to their mental health, because they have something very specific to focus on and to improve. Whereas when you're experiencing something very generalizable, very difficult to control, very uncertain, then that's much harder to stop it affecting particularly anxiety or other forms of mental health.
Makes sense. I was sick recently with a cold, and I suffer that disembodiment so much. I just feel it's like a standard, like typical man flu, I think, just typical, just cold symptoms. But I just feel so disembodied. I don't recognize my arm. I don't really feel like my legs are my own. I had a triathlon in like 4 weeks from that, and I was just sitting there like, how on earth could I ever do a triathlon in this body? There's a real sense of just disconnect between my physical body when I'm suffering those sickness symptoms. And I wonder.
Yeah, I massively do as well. But, you
Yeah.
can do that in the lab. You can give someone a vaccine, like a typhoid vaccine, that increases peripheral inflammation. And many people, but people like us, not everyone, will feel terrible. They will feel absolutely terrible because of that raised inflammation in their body.
Interesting. So there's a distribution in the population of how correlated interoception is with mental health. Would that be right? So some people have a very strong correlation between like embodiment and mental health, and some people won't, and there's like variation in that trait.
Yes, and it's not entirely clear at what level that trait is, whether it's something to do with detecting bodily changes, which can be good or bad, depending on, what the change is, or whether it's something to do with interpreting those changes, or perhaps what you've previously learned matters with respect to those changes. So in my book, I talk a lot about functional neurological disorders, which is a really kind of under-communicated group of neurological conditions, but one of the most common types of neurological conditions in the world. The reason they get neglected, the reason why nobody talks about them, no one wants to study them, is because they get kind of shafted to psychiatry, and they get told it's all in your head, it's a mental health problem, it's like depression. But what they really show is that you can have a physical health problem, a totally physical health problem, that is generated by changes in your brain, not like pathologies in the classic sense, like degeneration, but changes in your brain, something your brain has learned, probably about your body in the past, and that it's able to regenerate, like that inflammation example in the animals that I gave in the beginning, how the brain could create inflammation. So too, your brain can create physical symptoms, and we don't entirely understand why or how, but we know it's possible. And it's a kind of condition that really opens your eyes as to, in fact, the human experience, the fact that when you have a physical symptom, physical experience, you personally do not know the cause. Even if you are a highly educated neuroscientist, et cetera, you have no way to know, is this something that's happened to my pinky, or something that my brain is generating that I feel about my pinky?
Right. Yeah, it's a really good point. Something that you might be interested in that I've been doing recently is experience sampling. So this is why I'm so interested in my interoception and understanding my bodily experiences, because for the last 10 weeks I've been carrying around this device, and it's been beeping me at random times, and I've been writing down my experience. And just before this podcast, to prepare, I wanted to go back through the notes and kind of see if I could find any relationships between strong bodily sensation in my awareness, which one of my discoveries that I've had over these 10 weeks is that almost every beep has a bodily sensation. So I think I'm strongly, I don't know what you'd say, strongly embodied or highly interoceptive, whatever wording you would use. And I did see, now this is just me looking correlations on notes, but when I did have bodily sensation, there was positive affect attached to it very commonly, which I find very interesting. And I kind of assumed that I was individual in that point, but I don't understand how anyone could be otherwise.
Really interesting. Your personal experience of embodiment is so positive. I mean, that's not even the only example you've given of that. I think you're very, very lucky in that sense. And I think it demonstrates kind of this one level where I was saying we don't really know the level at which people differ. And that's the level of valence, the level of interpretation. Is it positive? Is it negative? The same signal between two people can be interpreted totally differently. Oh, a cool example is about satiety or fullness. So many people experience satiety positively. You feel relaxed, you're full, you're not hungry, it doesn't feel urgent. But a subset of people, particularly, for example, people with anorexia, experience it so aversively. It is really uncomfortable to be full. It's not at all relaxing. And this is a difference of interpreting one bodily signal that then can have very dramatic consequences.
Yeah, very interesting. It wasn't even the case that the signal coming from my body was necessarily positive. In that if I just exercised and my legs were sore, even just there being a sensation seemed to have. Now that was also because exercise obviously does boost mood afterwards. But even if there was sort of a tired sensation from my body, I was positively associating that with my overall mood.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it's funny you mentioned about the sore legs, because actually not a research anecdote at all, but that does vary between people, I discovered. So I also quite like the sensation of having slightly sore muscles. It's
Right.
not at all negative to me, but loads of people hate it. I'm telling you, once I started asking people, it turns out that a solid number of people are like, no, why would that be comfortable? That feels horrible. Like they really find it uncomfortable.
Right. Yeah, it just shows that there's complete variance in all of these traits. Variance is the norm rather than any level of consistency amongst humans, which is cool and wonderful, and just means there's so much more to learn.
Yeah, it is. So I basically dedicate the second half of my book to all possible treatments, all the common treatments for mental health conditions, ranging from psychedelics, psychotherapy, brain stimulation, antidepressants. And the reason for that is because it is my sincere belief that we will never have a single silver bullet for mental health conditions. We will never have one thing that cures depression. Instead, what I hope to contribute to is a world where we become much better at identifying who would benefit from what. But for now, if you haven't benefited from something, but your buddy has, unfortunately, the reality is what has caused your problem is probably distinct brain processes, distinct things in the body. And so they might respond to something different.
Right. Really, really important point. And we're going to get to a lot of those treatments later on in the podcast. What do we know why there's such variance in why, like say like psychedelics, for example, like why does it seem so efficacious in some people and then not at all in others? Is it just because the biological system is so variable? And is it also because depression isn't one thing? We have one label, but I spoke to a psychiatrist who said, there's something like 8 million ways that symptoms of depression can be combined to fit the criteria. So it's really not one thing, and we should probably try and tease it apart more. Do you think that?
I do. So one thing that is very important in explaining variability to treatment response is that a condition like depression is not one thing. You can have two people with depression and they might not share a single symptom in common.
Right.
So
That's
obviously
actually worth
it's not.
restating. I think that's probably just single sentence. Two people can have depression and not have a single symptom in common. That's a really, really interesting point.
But if the past 10 years have taught us anything, when I was a PhD student, I thought the solution was all these big data models were just going to put in symptoms and they were going to find better ways of classifying people and finding out what treatments work for them. And that approach has largely failed. And that's because just knowing someone's symptoms is just not enough. I think there is a level at which our own subjective report, two people could say they feel anhedonia, or two people could experience sleep deprivation, and that may not be close enough to the real mechanism causing that to map onto a treatment. So that's why I think we need sort of one step closer to understanding what's actually causing those symptoms. What's causing them, of course, is changes in neuron firing. But then at what level does that matter? Is it the level of kind of a neurochemical that differs? Is it a coordination between brain regions? We really don't know. But we do need to get one step closer to the actual cause, which is the nervous system.
Do you think the big data approach could work in the future when we figure out, 10 times more ways of measuring the body. Like the measurements that we have are just not big enough features in the depression model. But if our depression model had thousands of features and we had all of these little biosensors connected to all of our different organs and body systems and much more high resolution brain imagery, so we were able to see circuit level dynamics and what's going wrong, then big data might be able to crunch all of that and give a much more clear idea of diagnosis and treatment.
Yes and no. So, of course, if we had all the information in the world, then the answer is yes. That's just necessarily true if you're like a materialist, which I am. But is this going to happen just because we have, for example, better measurement of brain cells? Like if you had an implant in your brain, would we then somehow be able to do it? And maybe we would become slightly better. There is like a beautiful case study of someone with a particular electrode that could track her mood fluctuations and stimulate her at appropriate times. But even then, I think to develop some kind of really good mechanistic understanding, we also need to understand experiences. So we need to know the coupling between that brain activation and what is happening in someone's world and in someone's body to know, I think, what treatment would work for them. That is essentially what I'm describing as like the biological version of cognition. So I think that is the level at which we need to understand it, which is the interaction between a human and their environment, internal and external.
Yes, with the subjective first. Like I spoke to Ryota Kanai, who used to work in Arnold Set's lab, and he's doing some crazy implant stuff in Japan. He talked about these deep brain implants, which, we might be able to change our personality and, dial these things, change our mood. That seems a little bit dystopian to me, where we're all just sitting in our chair and we have like an app that we're controlling just the perfect neurochemical states. It seems like negative emotion and feeling pain and sadness is like foundational to the human experience, like there'd be no good novel or movie if we had this dial or like implant that just modulates us as we go. It seems like that's not humanity, and that would lead to anhedonia eventually somehow. We just can't be always in an optimal state. I don't really know if that exists.
I don't think an eventual goal, I don't think it's achievable, and I don't necessarily think it's desirable to feel nothing but positive states. I mean, it's very Brave New World. But I think it is certainly possible. A reasonable goal would be to be able to help someone when they were in the depths of sorrows, really the worst sorts of things that they've experienced. We do have that capacity for some people, maybe even for many people right now. But I think that is essentially, and always should be, the goal of this kind of treatment, not making everyone's life immune from sorrow impossible.
Yeah, he frightened me a lot in that podcast. What do you think is the role of the gut microbiome in mental health? This is a super interesting space. You see claims that I think are overblown. You see a lot of headlines. How do you, with everything you know about your research in the balanced brain and mental health, like what really is the role of the microbiome, our bacterial brain?
So I write about the microbiome a little bit in my book. I don't write about it loads. I don't have like a whole chapter on it. And the reason for that is because the research is still in development. It is so much in flux that just last week, I read a paper that slightly shifted my needle on the microbiome, not fully, but a little bit. So I'll tell you the kind of whole story of what the microbiome's involvement in mental health is. So of course, we have a microbiome everywhere in our body. We've got so many bacteria, like 39 trillion, I think. So just a remarkable population of bacteria that we have. And the microbiome in the gut specifically does seem really important for the immune system, for aspects of gut health, maybe even for cancers. So there's like, very clear, definitive health implications of the microbiome. Whether those implications extend to emotion and mental health is much more in development. So the area where the research is best, well, there are two areas where it's best. One, animal studies, where you can do like totally germ-free environments, really unusual environment that a human would never be in. And in cases like that, if you change the gut microbiome of a rodent, either make it worse, you can develop kind of anxiety, depression-like symptoms, or even give a sort of fecal transplant of a happier rat that can then improve its symptoms. And so that's very believable work, within that laboratory context. And then on the other hand, we also see big epidemiological studies where there are associations between certain gut microbiomes or aspects of gut microbiome health and mental health, anxiety, depression, and so on. And that's believable in its context, meaning that there are microbiome disruptions in certain populations. But the real problem there scientifically is the problem of causality, because there are a lot of other things that disrupt the microbiome. For example, antibiotic use massively disrupts the microbiome. And if you could imagine a world where people with worse physical health are on more antibiotics and also have worse mental health, well, ta-da, you've just created an association between the two. So although people try lots of various statistical controls there, it's impossible to control for everything. So we won't really know without very, very robust causal studies in humans. Now, I know people are starting and people are getting there. And as recently as last week, there's actually been sort of causal epidemiology work. So it's still epidemiology, it's still not certain, but it gets a lot closer to causality, showing the association between one particular disruption of gut bacteria. Actually, in this case, it's an increase, and mood disorders. So I think that it's research that's moving slowly. And if I had to kind of make a bet now, I would say it may be involved, but probably to a much smaller degree than what the animal studies would imply, because in a germing environment, actually what this does is it makes one very small contribution. And so there might be a subset of people where this is the thing that matters. But for many people, we live in such a microbiome-rich environment that just this one connection between gut bacteria and mental health is actually very small. But that's just my bet.
That was a good overview, because the field is full of hype, I think. So you would be maybe less hopeful of the future of someone manipulating their gut microbiome in some way and then having that being the treatment for their particular mental health problem. That's like less of a future that you're hopeful of.
I think it might not work as well if that's the direct path you're looking for. If you're somebody who experiences, let's say, IBS, which is highly comorbid with anxiety, well, that might be a case in which actually fixing your gut microbiome, if you had a pill that did that and so on, that might be something that would really improve your mental health, because in your case, your mental health is closely coupled with your gut health. So I think going about it in that indirect route, that seems likely and promising to me. But maybe the jury is still out on whether somebody with depression, which has somehow no gut relationship for them, would help.
Right. Makes complete sense. So a specific amount, there's a specific type of depression, anxiety cases that might be specifically gut related, might unsurprisingly have a gut treatment. But in general, with these probiotics for mental health that are being kind of flaunted and very common now everywhere, the evidence for that is the jury is still very much out on if a general case, if there is such a thing as general cases of depression or anxiety, that the gut microbiome is probably not the first line treatment.
Yeah, I think it's also just important to remember I'm not sort of extra critical of the gut microbiome. I actually just apply the same logic there as everything else, which is that not every patient is going to benefit from any new treatment, in my opinion. So I definitely don't think the gut microbiome is any different. But even with things where there's more proven causality in humans, so let's take inflammation, even then, the way that kind of top inflammation researchers in psychiatry think about this today is as a subtype, an inflammatory subtype of depression, or maybe subtypes plural, that might benefit from interventions on that domain.
Yeah. So what area would you be most hopeful of in all of the research that you've done? What are you really excited to see in the next 10 years be done, or any research avenue?
So in terms of treatment, the types of treatments that I think could be extraordinarily promising going forward are what I think of as augmentative treatments. Something where you take a treatment that works for many people, but not all, like, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, and then you make it work better using biology. And that might be using something like an anti-inflammatory drug, because maybe that specifically targets the kind of symptoms that CBT doesn't work very well on. Or maybe that's by using a kind of treatment, and it could be a drug or it could be a brain stimulation treatment that would improve someone's ability to engage with CBT while they're doing it. Or it could be something like an exercise intervention, which when combined has similar augmentative properties. So that's where I think, the closest goal is. Okay. It's not like that is the eventual dream treatment, etc. But I think we are getting very close to that kind of possibility where we will become much better at saying, let's make this treatment a little bit more personalized for everyone, but it doesn't mean that we are on a one-to-one person treatment mapping yet.
But always sort of some talk therapy combined with some biological change, whether it be pharmaceutical or brain stimulation or otherwise. But you always see it as there's probably always a talk therapy component to it where they're talking about their issues, and then the biological slider or whatever else you want to say. But is it always that pairing?
Now, that's good to challenge me on that, because I don't necessarily think that everyone needs talk therapy to benefit. I think this is a particularly good example of where science can help an existing treatment, but I don't think it's the only one. There are lots of people who might benefit, for example, from an exercise intervention alone without therapy.
Right. Makes complete sense to me. So you mentioned brain stimulation there. That's one that I don't really know all that much about. And some people might have a gut reaction to not liking, or they don't like that idea because it, brings images in their minds of like 1940s horror movies, or, the stuff you hear in World War II, what they were doing in science labs there, which is pretty horrific. What is brain stimulation for mental health in 2025, and why the hell does it work?
Yeah, I do understand people's reactions to it. So I've been working on brain stimulation for about 14 years now, and the field has really changed in that time. But I work exclusively in a subfield on non-invasive brain stimulation. So there's no surgery, and it doesn't include anything like ECT in my subfield. So I'm interested in things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which it looks like a kind of coil. It induces an electromagnetic field, and it causes the firing of a very small population of brain cells. And in that treatment's case, it's actually an incredibly effective treatment for depression when delivered in the right way. As effective as something like CBT or antidepressants, but maybe for different people. So that is, I think, a very promising intervention, not the only solution. So I'm also interested in other kinds of brain stimulation interventions. So we're working at the moment on a new kind of intervention sort of across the world. There's been a big development in the field, which is on transcranial focused ultrasound stimulation, which uses ultrasound waves. And the physics of this allows it to go much deeper into the brain and much more specifically. And then something like the magnetic type of stimulation that I described, or other kinds of electrical stimulation, which very much stick to the outside of the head and are very diffuse in where they can target. So we now have this kind of really remarkable ability to go very deep and change regions very selectively, which is like a power and a responsibility. Because all of a sudden it means that we are closer to what until now you could only do with surgical brain stimulation. I should say in very severe cases, surgical brain stimulation is useful for some psychiatric disorders. So for OCD, for example, in very severe cases, there are many people who've benefited from surgical electrodes being implanted in their brain. But, it's not a intervention for the masses, something you really have to think about that could come with side effects. Any surgery, of course, has risks. So I think bringing that kind of intervention, but to a safer context, non-invasively, is extraordinarily promising. But my vision for it is actually not necessarily as a standalone therapy, but probably combined with something like psychological therapies.
Interesting. I'm kind of surprised to hear that it's so localized on a very small select set of neurons, when in my mind, sort of my mental model I have for mental illness is that it's a very holistic brain process, involves like wide reaching circuits, lots of neurons acting in some sort of holistic, sort of dysfunctional pathological way. I'm surprised that kind of just targeting subsections of tiny neural circuits can really have such a big effect. Can you talk about like what those circuits are doing specifically and why that has such a broad effect holistically on the brain?
Yeah, so definitely both are true. If you look at what happens in the brain when you target with ultrasound a very small region, and I should say this is not a couple neurons, right? We're still talking about a ton of neurons in like a millimeter squared of brain tissue, for example, or even in smaller areas, a millimeter cubed. So if you look at what happens in some of the early studies, it's actually a general change in whole brain networks that you can measure just from stimulating these tiny regions. And this is a kind of an amazing property of brain stimulation. Now, are you changing the right networks? Are you changing them in the right directions? How long lasting is that change? At the moment, maybe an hour or two from a single session, but how can you actually make it last longer if you want it to? These are all very open questions, but it does certainly have very global changes despite its
Interesting.
local effects. So it's not a view that mental health is caused by that one tiny region. It's that by knowing where to target, you can get at these kind of hubs of coordinated activity in the brain that then might improve someone's, in this case, mental health.
How much do you think we understand about what's going on there? Like, how much did we mathematically find these exact circuits to be the right ones to zap, or was it a bit of a stochastic process? We were kind of zapping, seeing what effect would happen, zapping a different area, seeing what would happen, and how much of it was careful calculation because we knew what stimulating those neurons would have, what effect it would have, or how much of it is kind of random and, oh God, that one really works.
So we're in different places with the two forms of stimulation that I described. With the more established one, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where there are clinics all over, but particularly in North America and Canada and in the US, that give treatment, TMS treatment for depression. There we have a pretty good understanding of the connectivity that changes from TMS and why that matters. So with this kind of brain stimulation, you can only really target the outside of the brain. So you target a region called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex most of the time. That region is disrupted in depression, but it's kind of most, its influence in this context seems to be via its connections with a deeper region in the brain, or deeper regions, plural. In contrast, so we kind of understand a little bit about what that network is and why it's working. We understand a lot less when it comes to ultrasound. We're in that phase that you described of working out which are the regions that matter. In fact, working out which are the regions that target, which are the networks that matter. So both are unknown, and we're working on all of them.
What is that brain region in the ultrasound case? You say it's deep into the limbic sort of circuits.
Oh, multiple regions are being tried, even sometimes in the same context. So it might be that you want to target more than one brain region in a session, and that is possible. That might be the solution, or it might be that some people, one brain region is the best target and others another one is. So it kind of opens up, massively opens up the space of possibility.
Right. So again, it's personalized. In the case of brain stimulation, does this happen over a number of weeks? And again, would that person be going through possibly talk therapy at the same time? Is this an ongoing process that takes a while?
It's something that takes at least a number of sessions. It depends how intense those sessions are. So some clinics are delivering many in a day, and then you can finish more quickly rather than it appears you can kind of have the same sort of dose as if you do it, one a day for longer, which is what many clinics use. But this is all with the established form, and we don't actually know what the right protocol is for these new forms that people are developing. And I should say there are also other types as well. So many people are interested in a form that I've worked on before called transcranial electrical stimulation, which is the very mild, diffuse form. And in that case, somewhat uniquely so far, you can do it yourself at home. So that has huge potential, kind of just from a pragmatic point of view, compared to the others, but it's not as localized and it can't go as deep. So it has kind of scientific barriers.
Right. It's interesting to me that an intervention like that wouldn't just, like, the brain wouldn't regress back to normal after a number of months. You know what I mean? There would be some synaptic changes, some rewiring, but that it wouldn't regress back. What do you think that tells us about, maybe is there a predictive brain processing account there, that in that time where the brain isn't in that pattern, it sort of unlearns those negative thought patterns, and it doesn't predict those negative thought patterns as much anymore. And it's sort of similar to psychedelics, where you might need just one jolt, one big holistic rewiring, and then you can go maybe 6 to 12 months with that rewiring, and in that time your brain kind of unlearns those negative thought patterns and loops, and then that's can be accounted for somewhat in that predictive framework that we were talking about earlier. Is that the right way to think about it, do you think?
Yes. I mean, in many ways, that's actually how I think about all treatments, even something like antidepressants, which don't work right away. So they're at the other end of the extreme, where it takes weeks for them to take effect. And then in theory, you have to be on them for longer. Not everyone agrees about that. But if you eventually are on an antidepressant, and immediately it doesn't have some kind of acute effect on your mood, but it does change subtle things about the way you interpret the world. You might interpret neutral events as a little more positive, or negative events as a little more neutral, and only cumulatively do those events have an effect on your mood. And I think another way of thinking about cognitive behavioral therapy is as something where you're actively trying to change those interpretations. And a one-off also probably doesn't have much of an effect, but cumulatively, and especially you personally going out and using those techniques, causes those changes. So with something like brain stimulation, there probably are people who would regress in your brain state, would revert, as with psychological therapy. But there also are people where that particular experience will cause sort of sufficient neuroplastic changes that then it has a maintaining effect. And the same is true of psychedelics or of ketamine, for example. Often it's not a one-off, even though that's different than antidepressants in that it can work right away. A single ketamine infusion can cause remission from depression, but that doesn't necessarily last forever.
Yes. And I'm guessing we don't really know why some brains regress and some brains don't. Why some brains go back to predicting the negative and some brains can maintain that state. I presume there's a lot of murkiness and unknown in that as well.
One possibility is that, the people who maintain it are the people who kind of harness the right brain circuits in the first place. So a few years ago, I ran a study with that kind of non-invasive electrical stimulation, the milder form that people can do themselves. So in this case, I actually did it in therapy clinics. And what we found was that the people who responded best to it were the ones who had the highest levels of activity in that brain region in the first place. So that sort of means that it was the people whose neurons were already in that more active state, which was something we measured during a kind of difficult cognitive task in the fMRI scanner. And so they were able to benefit from that particular form of brain stimulation. So that's just one example. I don't think it's the only region involved, but I think that example of being in a brain state that is amenable to that particular change accounts for some of the individual differences between people.
Right. And could that be used as a pre-screening then to basically predict if the treatment is going to be successful? We can use that as a marker to say that that brain stimulation is likely to work in this case because we're seeing this neural signature.
Yeah, so that's one of the real benefits, I think, of something like brain stimulation is that we have access to the direct thing that is working on, which is the brain.
Right.
And so in theory, biomarkers should be more available. And there are some good studies on biomarkers for brain stimulation, but it doesn't mean that same idea couldn't be used for other kinds of approaches as well. And I do think it's entirely plausible to develop biomarkers in general, including for, lifestyle interventions as well as pharmacotherapy as well as psychotherapy.
Yes. You mentioned antidepressants a few times. I have to go to SSRIs. I think they're seeing a lot of coverage at the moment, mostly on the negative side from what I'm seeing. I recently spoke to Dr. Joanna Moncrief on the podcast, who makes a very convincing case to me personally that SSRIs are very overprescribed at the moment. She unequivocally says they do more harm than good, which I don't know enough to make a statement like that, so I'm not going to, but it's very strong statements. In general, how do you think about SSRIs and the amount they're being prescribed at the moment? It's hard to tell, but maybe somewhere between 10 and 20% in the UK and in the US. Like, it is a lot. Hard to get exact numbers. That seems way too high. In general, what are your thoughts on SSRIs?
The question I have a sort of scientific answer, and then I guess I have a more philosophical answer.
Yes.
What does it mean to be too high? Because if somebody benefits from something, let's imagine many people now take hormone replacement therapy when they go through menopause. So you could say the rates of hormone replacement therapy are too high. But are they? If a lot of people benefit from them, they come with some risks. They come with some reduction of other risks. Actually, I think it's a little bit demeaning to a patient who hopefully has appreciated the risk-benefit trade-off of taking hormone replacement therapy to say, like, en masse, we are giving too much HRT for menopause. So I kind of take the same attitude to antidepressants, which is that I would like to have an arsenal of treatments for mental health problems where we have many options and everybody gets the best option possible for them. And I think for some people, that option is antidepressants. And it's possible that there are people today who are on antidepressants who would actually benefit from some brilliant other treatment that we haven't invented yet, or sadly that the NHS can't pay for. So either way, I think there are people who maybe could be on something else. But if they're benefiting from an antidepressant, if they and their psychiatrist, their GP have together decided this is worth the cost benefit for me, then I wouldn't say we're prescribing it too much. I would say we're prescribing the right amount in that scenario. And then scientifically, I guess I also have a disagreement with Joanna Moncrief. So it's not that I disagree kind of point blank with the idea that there are side effects and also withdrawal effects sometimes from SSRIs, but it's very complex to look at those because there have been studies showing that some of those are driven partly by anticipation. So essentially a nocebo effect. You can't as an individual know when you take a medication whether you're having a side effect as a result of that medication, as a result of something else that's going on, as a result of anticipating that particular side effect. All of those are possible, like with the pain in your pinky. So I think actually from an individual point of view, it can be very difficult to know the origins. But if it's not working for you, you should work with a doctor to get off it. Yes. Rather, I think when you're making a kind of point blank claim, like they don't work or they cause more harm, I think that's when you get into the data. And actually, in my view, the strongest data shows that they do work at a population level. That doesn't mean they work for everyone, and it doesn't mean they're free from side effects. But I do think the strongest data is that antidepressants are effective for depression. I think we have a biological disagreement, which is, what is the cause of depression? Is it something that's going on in your life that should be remedied by changes in your life? Is it something that's going on in your brain that should be remedied by changes in your brain? And I sort of think, why not both? Sometimes you can change your life. Sometimes you can't change your life, but you can change your brain. Sometimes your life is objectively pretty great, but you don't feel that way. And that is still just as real. So I personally don't have a philosophical problem with changing the brain. I don't think it means something Joanna and I are aligned on is that it doesn't mean you have a deficit in that chemical in the first place. I'm pretty certain that that's not the cause of depression. And serotonin is involved, of course, as a neurotransmitter. Dopamine is involved. But I think there was a kind of mistake early on in attributing the fact that SSRIs worked, which they do, to the fact that depression must be caused by a deficit. And it's so appealing, it's so sexy. Then a lot of people used it. It was used in adverts. It was used by pharma companies, maybe abused. So we are in alignment on that. But I'm not paid by big pharma ever. And I don't think that antidepressants are a ruse. I think for many people they work.
No, it's a good balanced opinion. And I knew you would be able to give good data on it. Something that blew me away with that episode was I probably had 50 different people reach out to me to say their lives were ruined by antidepressants, by SSRIs, completely obliterated. And it broke my heart. Something I never would have predicted. I didn't know existed. And their emails like really tugged at my heartstrings. And these are people that did not know what they were getting into, did not have full knowledge of what they were being prescribed, did not know the side effects would go sometimes 10 years after they stopped using the medication. It's devastating. And people there was a number of people that went in with say a mild bout of temporary anxiety and came out with 10 years of sexual dysfunction.
Wow.
And that kind of break, and I understand, I think everything you said there is perfectly legitimate, but I'd kind of be a bit skeptical that maybe a lot of people are fully aware of the risks that they're taking, that when they start these treatments, that they withdrawal symptoms can go for a lot longer after they stop taking the medication. Somewhere between 50 and 60% have emotional blunting, and I don't know if enough research is done on that.
I 100% agree with you, basically.
Yeah.
I think that there are, individuals who have had terrible experiences with doctors and shouldn't have been put on antidepressants in their case, or should have been taken off them earlier or better. But I just don't think it's unique to antidepressants. So of course, yes, I want medicine to be better, and I want medicine to understand side effects better. For example, I've been through IVF. A lot of people don't talk about this, but when you go through IVF, you have the most enormous explosion of side effects. It is horrible. And some of those side effects last. They really last. And you don't really know what you're getting into. And I think that is kind of an example of a very commonly used medical treatment that doesn't get the headlines of we overprescribe antidepressants, but also has really important patient stories that we should listen to. So I want to hear those patient stories as much as the next scientist. I just also think we have to balance that with saying there are many people who have benefited and their voices matter too. But I do want to listen to those stories, and I do think there are practices we could change.
Yes. Yeah, no, it really did surprise me, because I just had no association that was going on, and that was the case, that people were suffering these side effects. Entire groups representing those people reached out with thousands of members, and it just seemed like this was a much larger issue than I thought.
Yeah, and there are examples of genuine malpractice in that area. Yeah. So this is not to dismiss it. There are examples of, for example, like pharmaceutical companies hiding particular groups who shouldn't be given particular medications, and then that having horrendous effects. So there are all these kind of like, you can dig into lots of drugs on this, but there are all these stories in antidepressants of those kind of negative things happening.
Yeah, evidence that they buried, evidence that they did cause. I think it was Pfizer directly buried evidence that this SSRIs caused those negative side effects in the 1990s.
Yeah,
and they still actively. I don't think it was. Maybe it's less so, but I think they still advertise the serotonin imbalance in depression in the States, in America, where psychiatric medicine advertisement is just a really strange thing for anyone from the UK or Ireland. Like it's so bizarre. I'm glad you're watching TV and then you're just getting psychiatric medication advertised to you. It's pretty bonkers.
Yeah, any medication advertised to you feels very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's just so weird. And they legally have to list all the side effects, and it's just like, it's like reality breaking. Anyway, that's probably another full discussion. Camilla, this has been so much fun. You're such a good communicator on all these different things. I wish I had another hour with you. I want to pin you down to something like that you're really the most excited about. What's the most promising? And asterisk on that is that it's highly personal and highly individualized. I think that's one thing that we've definitely figured out, is that treatment will be personal. But if there was like a treatment that was most efficacious over the whole 8 billion people in the world, what do you think that treatment would be? Again, big asterisks on everything is individual and personal.
Well, I'm going to tell you what I'm most excited about, but it would undermine my very point of the book to say that there's one treatment. But the thing I'm most excited about brings us right back to the beginning, which is the intersection of physical and mental health, and the role of physiological processes in the body in mental health. And this may not be 100% of people. But if I had to bet on one thing, the thing I'm most excited about, it is that our understanding of the body-brain connection is accelerating at such a rapid pace that we will be able to integrate physiological measurements and hopefully treatments in mental health, within the next decade. That would be my goal.
Yeah, I love that. That's so cool. Camilla, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your work. Everyone should go read The Balanced Brain. It's genuinely fantastic. It's one of the first books I've read that's really combined this predictive brain processing framework into mental health. I've never really seen them combined in the way that you did, so I really appreciated that. There's some really cool experiments in there, like the vitamin study I wanted to get to, but we didn't get time for it. Lots of fun stuff. Camilla, thank you so much for your work. It's been such a pleasure to chat.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you enjoyed it so much. Yeah.
There's no doubt that the pharmaceutical industry very deliberately used this idea of depression being caused by a chemical imbalance in order to promote the SSRI antidepressants. Had they been told that actually there wasn't a chemical imbalance, this had not been demonstrated, and we don't know what the drugs do or how exactly they're altering your brain, they would never have taken them. Some of whom were angry that they had been misled into taking antidepressants in the first place. What we're doing is we're introducing foreign chemicals into a very delicate system, and we are discovering years later that that has, all sorts of untoward consequences.